we're not giving Gen Z enough credit because so many of us Boomers and Gen X are like, oh man, these kids are lazy. Nuh-uh. These kids are exposed to infectious agents, to the climate emergency, and to witnessing these really traumatic events in real time in ways that we were never exposed to. Of course, their nervous systems are dysregulated, and trauma healing starts with self-compassion and asking, why does it make sense that my mind-body system is responding in this way? And I think that's a really important question for us to ask whenever we see that dysregulation.
I dreamt that you were twisted through seven.
Hello, welcome back to the Soberful podcast. I am joined today by Dr. Christy Gibson. Welcome, Christy.
Oh, it's lovely to be here, Veronica.
It's nice to be here. And we met in another group that we're both members of, a EFT, where we get our supervision. So we met there. So Dr. Gibson, so you were a family physician, but you're now a trauma therapist and the author of the Modern Trauma Toolkit, which was why I was like, oh, perfect. We have to get you on the show because you've done a lot of work around addiction and trauma, right?
I have. I've been managing different forms of substance use my entire career as a doctor. I did inpatient medicine. And then when I moved to community and I did have a family practice, the majority of my folks had either faced an addiction or were in recovery. And so when I started to focus more on trauma, it was a very natural place for me to land in an addiction clinic where I would be referred folks who need trauma therapy. So it's been a big part of my practice for well over 20 years.
Wow. Okay. So we know so much more about trauma now and how it affects us as human beings than we did. I mean, certainly when I did my training. Tell us, what do we know now that has changed?
Well, honestly, the biggest thing that I learned about 8 years ago was the ACEs study. So the same year I graduated medical school, the ACEs study came out, and that's the Adverse Childhood Experiences study out of California, which was done with about 10,000 of the regular patients at Kaiser Permanente. So they just surveyed a huge swath of people to find out what kinds of things had been harmful to them in childhood. So abuse and neglect in specific events. And they kind of arbitrarily chose 10 things to study. So it's not the best survey tool, apart from population-based surveys. But what they found was just so remarkable. It was an absolutely exponential increase for every physical, mental, and social health outcome that they measured. So if you had an ACE score of 1, the risk of every disease that they measure and every outcome they measured went up a little bit. But if you had an ACE score of 8, it was skyrocketing to the point that people had a lower life expectancy the more ACEs that they had, which really does freak people out when they check out their ACE score. And so I always reassure them it was a population-based outcome, not a individual outcome. And the fact that you're in trauma therapy now probably mitigates that risk. So that was just so shocking to me that it was one of the single biggest risk factors for every single illness that we try to intervene as physicians. And yet we don't learn any tools with how to manage it. And once I started doing a bit of work, the first thing I tried was accelerated resolution therapy. And I was curing PTSD in my family practice. And once I made that link, I thought, this is the most downstream that I could get to help the folks that I work with. And I've always worked in equity deserving communities, and they face more substance use and way more challenges.
Okay, so let's start with, how do you define trauma?
So trauma is not the ACEs. Trauma is not the thing that happens to you. Trauma is something that happens in the body. So if you have a family of 3 or 4 kids and they all experience the same things, some of them might exhibit complex trauma symptoms as adults and some might not, or they might exhibit it in really different ways. So trauma is the way that it affects your body. And so it can be an event like a natural disaster, and then it changes your brain to start to feel like the world is more dangerous, and then you exhibit the symptoms of PTSD. And I can get into those if you'd like. It can also be relational trauma where you're not getting your needs met, or you start to lay down this thought pattern, this foundational belief as a kid that you don't deserve things to happen. There's something wrong with you because of all the things that are happening to you in relationships. So that's like a shame wound. And that kind of trauma healing looks a little bit different. And we generally call that a complex trauma or developmental attachment trauma, but many different things happen over a period of time. So all of that changes the nervous system, both the brain and its foundational beliefs, how the brain works, like what your amygdala does, which is your smoke detector that decides if things are dangerous or not, and then your nervous system. A lot of us get locked into fight, flight, and freeze responses. And so all of that provides a lot of pathways and signals where it can be healed.
So let me clarify. When we say ACEs, what we mean is adverse childhood experiences. So what could those things be?
So the ones that were measured on the original survey were issues like abuse. So having physical, emotional, or sexual abuse or witnessing it. Also neglect. So not having the things you need, whether that's like financial or food or clothing, emotional neglect. So not feeling like anyone cares about you, and witnessing abuse of others, or the death of somebody that's close to you, a parent going to jail, a parent being an alcoholic. They also rated sexual abuse that happened in mother or grandmother. So they measured very specific things, and they left a lot of important things out, especially in North America. We're now more aware of how much racism hurts. Kids are talking to us about how much bullying hurts. And those kinds of things weren't measured on the ACE score. So while I think it was a really important survey and one of the most important research projects that's ever happened in medicine, it does leave us with an incomplete assessment of the events that can cause trauma.
Oh, I have so many questions. So what was surprising to me was the link between trauma and physical health. Like, I don't think, we hadn't put that together before. I mean, for a long time, back when I was growing up, there was this very much the attitude, well, you're an adult now. Just get, there's something about turning 18, everyone knows right from wrong, get on with it. And not this sort of not really understanding that, well, you're an adult now, you had a rough childhood or whatever, that's sad, but you're a grown up. But it changes our neurosystem, but it affects our physical health. Now that I found fascinating. So tell me a little bit about the links between trauma and physical health. Because I think that we almost, because it is, I think before we just separated the mind and the body, right? If you get diabetes, you get diabetes. Just, if you have obesity, all the different things, heart disease, whatever, just that's just your genes, or, maybe lifestyle. But there's a real link now between the mind and what happens in the body, isn't there?
And we can't differentiate. In Descartes' dualist philosophies of what the human body was like, they did separate mind from body, but it is so interconnected. And that's something else that I didn't really get a full understanding of in my original studies in medical school. So there is a biophysical explanation in our neuroanatomy about how the brain affects the body. And one of those things is when our amygdalas, that's the smoke detector that decides if we're in danger or not. When they've been in danger, they tend to do one of two things. They tend to amplify the signal of danger and leave it locked on, which is what causes the symptoms of PTSD, things like hypervigilance, avoidance, intrusive thoughts like flashbacks and nightmares, and having a negative worldview. So once those start happening, that is your sympathetic nervous system, or the system that wants you to move. And what it wants us to do, because we're mammals, the same as a horse or a deer or a dog, it wants us to fight or flight. It wants us to run away from our problems or fight them, because that's what mammals do. It's their only tool. So even though humans have these really complex brains, our reflex for danger is actually quite simple. And it doesn't work in modern times because we generally can't run away from our problems. And what it leaves us is in locked sympathetic state. And fight and flight in modern times feels like lots of tension in the muscles. It feels like heart pounding, so it can affect heart and lung function. And it sends all of the energy to the heart and lungs because it thinks we're about to move away from the problem. And the brain feels restless. It's hard to sleep. And we're sending out constant hormones and neurotransmitters related to the stress response. So lots of cortisol flooding the system. But more importantly, it turns off our parasympathetic system, which is the system that's in charge of digestion, immunity, reproduction, and rest. So rest is where we restore and we repair so much of the body. Like our body is a self-healing organism. If it detects cancer, it heals it. If it detects infection, it heals it. And when those systems go wrong is when our immunity is not working at its best. So part of the work is trying to keep a healthy body through lifestyle and good nutrition, good sleep. And part of the work is spending enough time in your parasympathetic state that your body can do its natural healing mechanisms. So that's definitely one piece of it.
And that's, I mean, there's probably still a lot more to learn there, isn't it? But that's fascinating. So the brain is stopping the trauma in the brain that is unprocessed and unreleased, isn't it? Is affecting how our body functions. Our bodies are not functioning effectively because of that. Okay, so I have several questions. I want to ask about like healing from trauma. I also want to ask about kind of almost the overuse of the word trauma, that everything's a trauma and everyone's got traumatized in some way. Let's talk about it, like healing methods and what you like and what works and because I believe, I've worked with lots of clients over the years who've had all manner of trauma, and I've seen people recover and I've seen people live full lives. That's part of their history, it's part of their story, but it no longer has ownership in the present day. And I'm really interested to hear how you work with people.
Absolutely. I had to do a lot of learning. So the first thing that I studied was polyvagal theory. And it's not a perfect theory, but it really clinically helps me understand what's happening in a person's body. And so we've talked about one branch of polyvagal theory, which is that fight and flight response. But what happens when that response is overwhelmed is we go into freeze collapse. And that's the other part of the vagus nerve that most doctors don't learn about, but it's really important. So when we're in an overwhelmed parasympathetic state, the way that shows up in the animal body is they just lay down and play dead and hope the problem goes away. Well, humans kind of do that too. Like we don't get out of bed, we don't get off the couch, we numb out using substances. So that's where that piece also kicks in. So one of the first things I do is help people notice, are you stuck in a high tone activated fight and flight response? Or are you stuck in a low tone collapse? The body is kind of frozen and stuck response. And that will help me discern which pathway I'll go down as a trauma therapist. And the other really important thing is it helps people get back in tune with their own body signals and to notice what state they're in, because so much of the time we're dissociating whether we're using substances or doom scrolling or shopping or overworking, and we're totally disconnected from our own signals. So the first step is reconnecting to those signals and learning how to change the volume dial, whether sometimes we need to turn the volume down because it's too intense. And sometimes we need to turn the volume up and listen to what's been suppressed for so long. So that's the first stage. And I use a lot of body-based therapies for that, because when your amygdalas are really busy and they're telling you that there's danger, it actually kicks out the connection to your prefrontal cortex or your thinking brain. So many people I work with say, it's hard for me to concentrate, I can't remember anything. And I'm not going to jump into thinking-based cognitive therapies because that isn't even available to them. So I love somatic therapy, body-based, bottom-up therapies at this initial stage. And so I've learned a giant toolkit, which is why I wrote the Modern Trauma Toolkit, to help people learn somatic skills that they can learn their own nervous system again. And Deb Dana, the clinician associated with polyvagal theory, she calls this befriending your nervous system. And it's such a nice, gentle way to remind you that you can nurture your path. You don't have to force it. So that's the first stage. The second stage is trauma processing. And the third stage is resourcing and reconnecting. And I use different tools for each of those stages. And I really personalize it based on where each person's nervous system is at, how much access they have to the trauma memories, because I don't tend to talk about the trauma, because every time you think and talk about those memories, you actually strengthen them. So I've learned a lot of different tools that you can use without necessarily going into the details of the trauma. Tapping uses one called matrix re-imprinting. That's one of my absolute favorites for relational trauma.
Same.
It's joyful.
It's so good.
It's so good. And people leave feeling good. So some trauma therapies, they leave feeling exhausted and drained and like they've just been tortured. They finish a matrix re-imprinting session and they're like, wow, I feel in control again. I feel so good. I feel like I was really gentle on my parts, these younger parts of us that were harmed. And I just love therapies that do that.
Okay, so I want to explain what matrix re-imprinting is to the people listening, because so I was trained as a psychotherapist, and our training was to get people to talk about it and talk about it and talk about it and talk about it and talk about it. And I want to say there's different strokes for different folks, and there's gauging that can be helpful. But once I discovered EFT, and then when I discovered matrix re-imprinting, I just go straight to that, because you don't have to talk about it. It is about being in the body. So EFT, you guys have heard me talk about it before, emotional freedom technique. It's tapping on parts of the body to release negative feelings. It's really effective. Matrix re-imprinting. Well, do you want to you explain what matrix re-imprinting is?
Sure. I'm obsessed.
Me too.
So matrix
Me too.
re-imprinting uses tapping. So the self-acupressure sequence that we've learned, it modifies it a little bit. I think of it as quantum therapy, because what you're doing is you're taking the adult integrated self and all of their knowledge, and you're asking them to interact with these younger parts that were harmed. So the time that's imprinted around your foundational belief, where you started to believe that the world isn't safe, that you don't deserve care, all of these foundational beliefs that happen in these relationships related to the ACEs, we can go back in time and change that event. So you change the foundational belief at the moment it was laid down, and you use your adult consciousness to do it. So you feel like you're in control the whole time, and you're nurturing your past self, getting them the experience that they would have preferred at the time. So memories are changeable. And this is another thing that I love sharing with my patients and in the Modern Trauma Toolbook is neuroplasticity can happen at any age. And I've worked with people in their 70s who are able to change their brains, both in terms of how the traumatic memory affects them in the present day and how their body responds to any kind of danger signal. And they learn that they can turn the volume down. So matrix re-imprinting is one of the most efficacious tools. It works a lot of the time, and it feels good to people. They finish a session, they've interacted with one or more younger parts, they've changed their foundational beliefs, they've changed that memory and how the memory feels in the present. And it's not like they can't access the reality of what happened, but they just feel differently about it. And that's the goal.
Yeah, it's really, I had a client, again, in her 70s, 72, really, really bad alcohol problem, couldn't stay sober longer than 6 months. And the problem was she couldn't be intimate with her husband without having alcohol in her. And it all came back down to she was date raped when she was 15. And we can't erase past events. What we do is we change the meaning, we change the emotional language. And so we did matrix on that. And I think she's sober, must be coming up to 2 years now. She emails me every so often. And it's just, it's incredible. So many people have these past things that they're carrying around that we hold in the body. That's the whole premise of EFT, that we hold all these negative emotions in the body. It's kind of amazing how this is changing. And are you seeing any changes in wider medicine at all in understanding this?
I do believe so. So I spoke at the Canadian Society of Addiction Medicine conference, and my workshop was well attended. And the current president of the CSAM has approached me to run some workshops on some of the skills that I do. So some of the, and what I did really carefully was I talked about evidence, of which there's great evidence for EFT, but also some of the other skills that I do, including brain spotting. And I explained the neuroanatomy of how that happens. I'd say, this is what happens in the brainstem, and this is what happens in the amygdala. So Frank Corrigan has done a lot of work around eye movements and turning of the head. With EFT, Peter Stapleton has done a lot of work. And so there are some researchers that are starting to get the evidence that doctors listen to. So I feel like because I can have both, feet in the academic world, I have a master's, I have a doctorate, I have these credentials that people will pay attention to what I'm saying. And I'm exploring all of these novel therapies that are coming up, and I'm trained in a wider array of a toolkit. So I love the Havering techniques. I love teaching that in really quick. I'm actually just writing a TED Talk right now, and I'm trying to decide, can I actually demonstrate the Havering techniques during my TED Talk? Because
Okay,
it's so easy to learn.
explain the Havering techniques, what they are.
I would love to. So both EFT tapping and Havering and tremoring are full chapters in the Modern Trauma Toolkit, and I have a 20-minute video attached to each chapter. So if you want more detail, please go ahead and look at the book. In the States, it's only $14 right now. It's a great investment. So Havering skills are really, really gentle brushing across the palm of the hand, from the shoulder down to the elbow and across the face. And what it does is it lowers your gamma waves. And this is measurable on EEG, not only in the basic research that informed the Havering creation, but also when I learned how to do it, they put a Muse headband on us and they projected our brainwaves on a screen. We could see in real time the gamma waves decreasing, showing agitated, restless, sympathetic tone, and delta and theta waves in the brain increasing. So we could actually see this happen in real time.
Wow.
So Havering techniques uses guided imagery. Sometimes we think about outcomes. Sometimes we use breath. We use a skill called affirmations. I'm on TikTok as TikTok Trauma Doc, and this particular video about affirmations got 1 million views right away. It's using an affirmation and just putting a what if in front of it. And that's something that's part of Havering techniques. So this is such simple things. You can do it when you're on an airplane, in a board meeting. You can teach your 4-year-old how to do it. And this and EFT and other kinds of nervous system regulation tools are the kinds of things that I just want to get into everybody's hands. I want parents and teachers and doctors and realtors and lawyers and anyone dealing with the public to learn how to self-regulate so that we're not always so anxious. Because what I am seeing as a doctor is a big increase in substance use. We're seeing so many opioid deaths here in Western Canada. It's an absolute tragedy. I see a ton of young women in their 30s and 40s with end-stage liver disease because of their alcohol use. And
my God.
These are not kinds of things that I used to see in this amount 20 years ago. So we are much more dysregulated. We're not coping, and we need better skills. And the way I think of addiction is, it was a solution to a problem before you had better solutions. And I'm going to give you as much of a toolkit as I can until you feel like you have better solutions.
Yes, I love that way. I love that approach because it's really important to acknowledge with alcohol and drugs is they work. They work initially, and just, a few glasses of wine is an anesthetic for so many people, and it works. But we need alternatives because eventually that's going to destroy us. I wanted to see what you thought about this, because I'm so glad that we're talking about this in the ACEs study, but I also sometimes feel that we're perhaps overusing the word trauma, that it's almost being trivialized. And lots of people also have trauma and have no mental health help, and have managed to overcome it and use and lead fulfilling lives and all that kind of stuff. What do you make of all of that?
I have a couple of different thoughts about it. One is that there's a predisposition, so much as there's a predisposition to certain kinds of illness like diabetes and MS. They might be activated by a traumatic event or a virus or something that's changed your environment, and then the cell turns that code on. So the code was always there, but then the cell turns it on. And every human body is different. So like I explained, you could have kids in the family and they each respond to the events from childhood differently. We also carry ancestral and pre-verbal trauma, and we don't have thinking brain access to these subconscious things. So ancestral patterns can happen in people that were exploited and harmed, and it actually changes their DNA. That's something called epigenetics. So we see that very visibly in First Nations people in Canada, and they continue to be harmed by cultural genocide, by medical trauma and systemic harms. And because of the extent of the harm in the previous generations through residential schooling and the scoop into the foster system, that changed their DNA. And they are carrying this ancestral burden of trauma. And the good news is you can even heal ancestral trauma if it's subconscious, especially using body-based tools, because it's not something you even have the language for. Pre-verbal trauma, things that happen before the age of 3, you're harmed somehow with abandonment or rejection in a way that you don't have language for, or you had a traumatic birth, like the umbilical cord was wrapped around your neck when you were born, and your mom released a whole bunch of cortisol into your system. You won't have a language for that, but there is something that changes. It's why I'm a huge fan of psychedelics, because this is one of the evidence-based ways, and people tend to be able to experience birth trauma. So we have to get more creative with how we solve the problem of trauma because of the different ways that it expresses in people. Some people have, I'm not going to use the word resilient because some people are forced into resiliency, but if you think about communities, equity deserving communities that undergo the most harm in society, these are racialized communities, immigrants and refugees, LGBTQ people, female identifying folks, and trans folks. They are really harmed in society right now. And that level of harm can be expressed as trauma. Trauma can also happen in witnessing. So right now, there are wars that I had Ukrainian refugees living with me for 2 years. And for a while, every day they were looking at the news and they were seeing videos because people put this stuff up on YouTube and TikTok, and they can actually see their countrymen being harmed in real time. This is happening in Gaza. We're witnessing and bearing witness. That is traumatic to all of us, and we don't recognize how dysregulating that can be. And so if we have this predisposition and this exposure to ourselves or as witnesses, that can be experienced as trauma. And I think we're not giving Gen Z enough credit, because so many of us, boomers and Gen X are like, oh man, these kids are lazy. Nuh-uh. These kids are exposed to infectious agents, to the climate emergency, and to witnessing these really traumatic events in real time in ways that we were never exposed to. Of course, their nervous systems are dysregulated, and trauma healing starts with self-compassion and asking, why does it make sense that my mind-body system is responding in this way? And I think that's a really important question for us to ask whenever we see that dysregulation.
So I want to ask you about psychedelics, because I have a lot of doubt about it, and it comes from my own personal experience, because it was actually psychedelics that I pushed me into psychosis that resulted in panic attacks and anxiety that escalated my alcohol problem. So I'm quite terrified of them, to be honest. I'm absolutely terrified of them. And I would never, when I was years sober, I was at a party or something, and someone said they'd put like magic mushrooms in the brownies as the chocolate brownies as a joke. And it was a joke. They hadn't, but but what I am reading is that there are people who have experienced just trauma that we can't even comprehend. And for those folks, psychedelics can be quite a legitimate form of changing the brain in a way that helps them to live with that. concern is all this microdose thing that's unregulated, that like I just see a lot of like, and we might do a podcast episode on this. I'm seeing a lot of it's Chip and I did it, my podcast co-host, we did an episode on high end drinking. So people who only drink wine from Napa and they go to Scotland to do the whiskey tasting with the $200 bottles, and they don't have an alcohol problem because they do they drink for the, the culture, and it's still ethanol, doesn't matter. And I feel like I'm seeing the same with there's the kind of Silicon Valley, they don't drink alcohol, they microdose. And I'm like, you're just taking drugs to numb and not feel. So there's that element to that. I'm open, and it's not an area I'm ever going to go into. So I'm open to that. It can be effective treatment for people with really severe trauma. I'm also concerned about that it also can be a gateway to abuse by practitioners, which does happen.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, that was a really big charge laid down against a founder of a psychedelic clinic in the city that I'm in. Like, yes to all of that. It is really complex. And I didn't mean to kind of open that gate without suggesting that it is complex. I personally have seen, and I've been trained in as a psychedelic guide. So I've done 3 different training programs. So I've seen the science behind it, which is getting to be quite good in a controlled setting. So really what matters is
regulated, well-trained practitioners.
Yes. So set means mindset. And you really have to be cautious around who to let through the intake. So a family history of psychosis or any hint of a predisposition, I wouldn't even consider it. So mindset is, what is the mind that you're trying to help shift, and what is their foundational belief system, their ability to self-regulate and stay in a calm body. Because if you access traumatic content while you're not in a calm body, you will just strengthen those pathways and make the whole thing worse. And then setting is so important. Like, can the person trust the practitioner that's helping them guide and integrate the journey? Do they feel safe in the physical environment? All of these questions need to be unequivocal before I would, and I don't do psychedelic guiding. I've just trained in it out of interest. But I have been a part of the experiences here a little bit. And so, yes, there is a corollary. So even though the research is looking quite good around trauma and addiction too, there is a giant corollary. And I think we're just in early stages. Like, the phase 3 clinical trials just started coming out in the last couple of years. We need more time to understand how not to cause permanent damage to the brain, which can also happen, and to really understand what it is that's happening. So, I mean, it's quite fascinating from a biological level. It's one of the things that can shift the default mode network or our sense of self. And that is really powerful. You shift a person's sense of self, you're shifting who they are. And we can't be playful with that. We can't be experimental with that. We have to be really hyper aware of both the benefits and the harms.
Yeah. I mean, that there's a lot to go into. I have a lot of doubt around addiction. And again, in harm minimization, there's so... My concerns are, is everybody wants a pill. Like, that's what Ozempic is, right? Everybody just give me the pill, the jab to fix the problem. And there's so much more about recovery from addiction than just not using the substance. It's like a pill can't teach you how to have boundaries with your mother, or how to deal with resentments and all of the stuff that led to the drink in the first place. So that's my concern is, I wonder where the pharmaceutical companies will go with it. Anyway, this is probably a conversation for it,
right?
Like,
we're already seeing that for sure. And I think of this as, like, if there's 3 stages of treatment from Dr. Judith Herman's model, this would be stage 2. So you still need establishing safety through self-regulation and examining foundational beliefs. And then at the end, you still need integration and resourcing and reconnecting.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are missing the first and the third stages. And to
Yeah.
me, those are the ones that take the most time. Like
Yeah.
everything I do in trauma is moving at the speed of trust. And if you jump into, oh, we're just going to give you this thing, you've lost the trust, you've lost the safety. So
Yeah.
establishing safety is key, and a lot of people don't do that. So I might jump into stage 2 work using accelerated resolution therapy or matrix re-imprinting in 3 or 4 sessions if I feel like a person has established safety, but it sometimes takes a
Yeah.
year. It sometimes takes 6 months, and I
Yeah.
can't predict that when I'm first starting out, and that's why it has to be personalized. So, as
Mm.
much as I wrote the Modern Trauma Toolkit to help people understand there's so much that they can learn on their own, they
Mm.
can't do matrix re-imprinting in the comfort of their, home. This is something that really does need therapy and guidance, and so
Mm.
stage 1 is something that is really, really important and is the work that I'm trying to get out to the world.
Yeah.
Stage 2, wow, that has to be careful.
Yeah. Tell me what success looks like. I mean, I want to end on like successful outcomes and what that looks like.
So I call this post-traumatic growth. And one of the key
Mm.
concepts that I share with folks is the difference between resilience and post-traumatic growth. So
Mm.
resilience by definition is reestablishing your baseline. And that's great. Like a resilient system gets back to normal after a challenge. Humans have the ability to do so much more. And post traumatic growth looks like exceeding your baseline. It's you've learned through examining the trauma, you've learned through having more of a sense of agency over your own nervous system. You've shifted your foundational beliefs and your relationship to those memories, and you come out on the other side of it different. And
Mm.
that's what post traumatic growth looks like. And it is astonishing when you work with folks how magical that transformation can be. And
Mm.
it's guided by them. There's no agenda on my part. It's them
Mm.
looking at their values and who they want to be and what should be different for them to um, have that sense of self and self compassion that is so different. And the way that
Mm.
they view themselves and view the world is changed forever in a way
Mm.
that they prefer. I don't
Mm.
imprint those ideas at all. But I do believe that in the Modern Trauma Toolkit, I give people a taste of what that could look like. I do believe it's available to all of us.
I love that. Yeah, it can lead to growth eventually, and we see people recover, and that's kind of the message I want people to hear is that with the right tools and the right practitioner, and sometimes it's trial and error, finding the right person at the right time with the right tools, that we can recover. Christy, this has been really informative. I have lots more questions, but thank you so much. So your book, The Modern Trauma Toolkit, highly recommended, loads of information and tools in there. Where else can people find you?
So I'm on socials as TikTok Trauma Doc on TikTok, and
TikTok
elsewhere,
Trauma Doc.
Christine
That's
Gibson
it.
MD. I know, isn't it fun? Yeah. I was so lucky that that was available when I
Yeah.
started like 3 years ago. And my personal website is christinegibson.net. I don't take on patients, but I do lots of speaking. So if you're looking
Okay.
at a keynote or a panel, I'd love to
Okay.
talk about all of this. And then I also run a company called Safer Spaces Training, and we work at employee public facing people who are self-regulating professionals. What does psychological safety look like in the workplace? So I think that's
Wow.
another place where a lot of folks are running into trauma, both
Yeah.
in themselves and others. So
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you, Christy. This is fascinating. I love your work. And I love how curious you are about this. I just can tell you're a lifelong learner about all we can do in this area. So thank you so much for your work and what you're doing. And please go and check out Christy's stuff, and we will put everything in the show notes. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Christy. And we'll be back next week.